My concern is if this is the sentencing for consensual same-sex relations, what is the sentencing for non-consensual opposite sex relations? If consensual same-sex relations is leading to 2 to 5 years in prison with a fine, what my question is especially in these African countries, will this be the same charge for, and will this be the same charge for heterosexual assault? Welcome back, everyone. This is another episode of Grid of the Diaspora, and I'm your host, Nakaira G. And today we're actually going to be talking about this new law that just recently passed, and apparently is awaiting for Captain Ibrahim Traore's signature. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this past Monday, news came out that Burkina Faso's government is passing a law against homosexuality and against the LGBTQ community. And so currently it is waiting for the signature of Captain Ibrahim Traore, and there are a lot of criticisms happening right now, especially amongst the people who was in big support of Traore. And so now we're seeing another thing that is becoming kind of popular on the African continent to go after this very minority population all of a sudden. And I want to really talk about and break down why African presidents targeting the LGBTQ community is really important and why it should not be happening. Because I think on the surface, people are going with this narrative that homosexuality is a Western tool, or it was brought into humanity by Europeans, and there is all of this speculation and miseducation, misguided education that is saying that the whole experience of being a homosexual person or a queer person is not natural. And now African presidents and African communities are regurgitating a lot of these political agendas without really a fair chance of research, even within their own national research archives. So let's break this down and really talk about it. But before I get into that, I'm just going to go over the quick facts about what's going on in Africa with these anti-LGBTQ laws. So this past Monday, a video came out of Justice Minister Adasso Rodriguez Balaya, who is one of the 71 members of parliament. Apparently, the parliament and the government in Burkina Faso is still not officially elected because, Burkina Faso's current military president is Ibrahim Traore because he won the coup in 2022, but there still has not been a full elected government system yet in Burkina Faso. So right now, technically, they are under a military dictatorship in technical terms, right? And so the law is awaiting for his signature, and that is pretty much where the pressure is coming into play, because all of the people, abroad specifically, let me be very specific. I can't speak for the Burkinabe people. Obviously, there are some Burkinabe people and West Africans who are really talking about this and who are against this, but specifically Africans and those of us in the diaspora who are not Burkinabe citizens or nationals and who are not from there, I think that this is a very big deal. Along with Ghana also being one of the countries that is a part of this, Mali as well as Nigeria, where they are not just creating laws against same-sex marriages. They're not even getting to the same-sex marriage part. They're 100% criminalizing homosexuality. And so for Burkina Faso, it's saying in the laws that they are planning to not only fine people, but to also imprison them up to 2 to 5 years. So in all actuality, this is becoming a criminalization on sexuality, period, right? Particularly homosexuality. So that is pretty much the hard facts that we know as of right now. So let's really get into this. I'm particularly I'm not understanding why homosexuality populations in Africa are being targeted as if this population is just so big that it needs to be stopped or controlled. I'm not really sure how African presidents are using information to make these justifications or these laws, but I can tell you what's happening, okay? Religion is playing a large role in this. Ibrahim Traore, many people in Burkina Faso are Muslim, just like in Ghana, where a lot of people are Muslim and Christian. In Burkina Faso, a lot of people are Muslim and Christian, or they are traditionalists. And somehow, one of the things that a lot of these different religions agree upon is anti-LGBTQ matters. And what I'm noticing is that it feels as if there is a class conversation that is happening, but not with money, particularly with education. I'm seeing a lot of African and African diaspora intellectuals, researchers, archival researchers, journalists, but particularly people who are in academia being some of the main people to actually go against a lot of these anti-LGBTQ efforts. And that's mainly because the evidence, the research, the history, the information is honestly out there when you start talking about where homosexuality came from, right? When you start talking about African societies where women being married to each other for whatever reason, even if it was non-romantic, those things still happened and it happens today. There are all women civilizations, all women villages all over the continent that still happen today. But what I notice is that there's a local community and a rural community whose voices are being silenced when these political conversations are happening regarding sexuality. And that really bothers me because something that I realized, and I said this in a past interview when I interviewed the study abroad student in Ghana, I mentioned how it feels like as an African person, as an African diaspora person, the more educated that we are on Africa's history, the more ostracized we actually end up becoming because our education is leading us to truths. And we're realizing that those truths are not just unpacking or decolonizing information that we've received from Western populations, but African history and being a historian and being a journalist and being a researcher will also lead you to the truths that a lot of African traditions have also instilled in many of us. And I think this conversation for me, when it comes to the anti-LGBTQ craze on the continent, is unfair simply because there is not enough political, social, and economic conversations that are happening, and instead it's a 100% religious and anti-Western aid conversation. So let me talk about why Western aid plays a role in this whole thing. Back in 2019, when the year of return popped off with Ghana's former president, Nana Akufo-Addo, one of the things that I've been paying attention to when it comes to West Africa in particularly and the relationships that West African countries are building with the US is that obviously when an African president comes to Washington to meet with the president, they're talking business, they're talking about civilization, they're talking about resources, they're talking about money. Aside from that, there are also conversations being had about what is and is not okay and what should and should not be laws and how can Americans be comfortable in your country in the way that your citizens are finding comfort in America, right? But what's been happening is Kamala Harris has been blamed over the past 3 years for promoting LGBTQ laws in Africa. There is this assumption that during Kamala Harris's trip to Ghana, when she was doing, prior to her campaign for president, actually, when she was Vice President Kamala Harris to Joe Biden, Kamala Harris came to Ghana and she did a tour, and there were all of these allegations that Kamala Harris came to Ghana to persuade the Ghana government to neutralize their anti-LGBTQ laws. That still has not been 100% confirmed. However, the assumption comes from Kamala Harris obviously being pro-LGBTQ in America, and also there have been statements while she was in America about not wanting to do business, or not wanting to be in cahoots with countries that are slamming down on their anti-LGBTQ laws, right? So the US, by proxy of Kamala Harris, have been used as almost the blame for pushing this narrative that people are claiming is coming from Kamala Harris or the US or the bigger picture of the West. And so there has been a conversation from the US Embassy, from the UN, and other USA organizations that have said if Ghana signs that law, then they will take away the aid. And that's where, again, if you look at my other video where I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Bontri Anyeti, he is a British Ghanaian and who has gone back to Ghana to live, and he also talked about why Western aid is not good for Africa. And this is why I said the conversation with Western aid is really important in this bigger conversation with homosexuality in Africa, because there were threats that the US would stop supporting and giving Ghana Western aid. So now, instead of this being a conversation about humanity and about rights and about gendered protection and sexuality protection and human protection, instead of this being a conversation about sexual health, child protection, women's rights, instead of the conversation being about that, homosexuality is now being used as a tool for Western, particularly the US, to threaten African countries into still giving them aid as long as they allow this thing to happen. And now, in a way, it feels as if these Western countries, particularly the US, are kind of co-opting homosexuality and kind of co-opting this narrative like it belongs to us, despite the fact that in America right now, under this Trump administration, it has also been very clear that a lot of these things are being rolled back. So it's very confusing, because as somebody who lives in America but has also lived in Ghana, I know that a lot of Ghanaians and a lot of the Ghanaian government, I also know a lot of African Americans in Ghana who are very homophobic, politically and socially, who are very much so like happy that Ghana's government is anti-LGBTQ, right? And it's almost as if all of this African research on African deities being described as two-spirited or two-gendered, all the way from Kemet, to Ifa. It's as if all of this information about the all-women villages that formed in Kenya simply because women felt like they were unsafe over the past hundreds of years. It's as if all of this information regarding African feminism prior to the colonial slave trade, it's as if all of this information is not at the disposal of these African governments. And I'm really afraid that Pan-Africanists are going to continue to be divided simply on this point of homosexuality. In my last point, I want to dig a little bit deeper now. What bothers me past the reasons that these African presidents are choosing to go after this minority population of homosexuals, or trans people included, non-binary people, queer people, intersex people, I'm assuming, are also included in that. And intersex people are people who are naturally born with two parts. My concern is, if this is the sentencing for consensual same-sex relations, what is the sentencing for non-consensual opposite sex relations? If consensual same-sex relations is leading to 2 to 5 years in prison with a fine, what my question is especially in these African countries, will this be the same charge for pedophilia? And will this be the same charge for heterosexual assaults? Will this be the same charge for child marriages? Will this be the same charge for domestic violence?
And so I looked deeper into the law, and there are actually statutes in this law that will include a ban on child marriage, as well as give women equal inheritance rights and made forceful marriage illegal, which I think is a really big positive step. But as you can see, like the rest of the caption, there is this false sense of liberation and unity when we exclude the LGBTQ community out of Africa. And I think that it's hard to justify one or the other. And I don't think that this is the push that we're all expecting to see.
What scares me, as somebody who has traveled through West Africa and has lived in Ghana for some time, what scares me a lot is seeing and knowing that domestic violence, child marriages, pedophilia is not really looked at as 100% negative thing. And in a lot of countries, in a lot of villages, in a lot of communities, especially impoverished ones, especially ones where young girls don't have the luxury or freedom to get an education, especially in communities where rich people hire poor Africans to clean their homes and they do not pay for them to go to school or to learn a trade. That population of people are the most vulnerable to sexual assault, especially power dynamic sexual assaults. What also scares me is that a lot of these countries have traditions within their countries, both colonial and pre colonial traditions, that support and promote child marriages. And so I'm just questioning, as much as I have always supported Ibrahim Traore, one thing that I will never do is support any form of a politician to the point of unaccountability, right? What bothers me about all of these African presidents is that I have not seen the same energy towards sexual assault. I have not seen any of these African presidents say, we have to stop child marriages in our country. We have to stop female genital mutilation in our country. We have to stop young girls becoming maids at the age of 4 years old and 5 years old and not being able to get an education. I want to see the energy of things that are actually a majority in the society, because child marriages, young girls not getting an education, but young girls being somebody's maid and sex slave, and all of those things are the majority. But what's the minority is the homosexual part. What's the minority is the homosexual population. What I also question is, I wonder if these African governments are also separating the difference between a child molester, sexual assault, and somebody who is consensually homosexual or consensually trans or whatever the case may be. That's what scares me as well, because if somebody is a child molester, that's not a sexuality, that is a crime. And what scares me is tradition and culture in African societies having more of an importance, that it goes without accountability simply because it's tradition and culture. That really bothers me and that really scares me. And that's something that I think more people need to pay attention to, especially those of us in the diaspora. Those of us in the diaspora who are also being marketed to become citizens, to own real estate. I really want you guys to continue to pay attention to the politics of the continent, because those of you who may be queer, those of you who may have young children, those of you who may think that you want to go to this new country and start a new life and have children, and your children end up being LGBTQ in a country where they can go to jail for that. I just want to know this peace of mind, this I'm going to a place where there's no racism mentality, especially coming from Black Americans, especially from Black people in the diaspora. I wonder, when you guys say you want a peace of mind from America and you want to live in a place where you're not dealing with racism, I wonder how much of that is also going to stand when you go to these other countries and they say the same thing. So now what will you do? What will you do now when you're in another foreign country, right? And they now say it is illegal to be who you are, or your child is illegal here. What's your next move? Are we just, as Black people of the world, are we just only here to feed someone's economy? However, we have to hide parts of ourselves in everywhere that we go. Are we as Black people going to have to be forced to find ourselves only nested in places in Europe where the LGBTQ communities are protected, to the point where we can't even go back home because home also is dangerous? So that's the question that I have. And I want to see how people feel in the comments. I'm sure we will talk about this again when there is more information. I'll probably talk about this in a This Week in Africa News segment, just to give an update if Ibrahim Traore signs this by the time that this video comes out or after. That's pretty much what we are all holding our breath on. In the meantime, I do want to say, make sure you guys check out all of the sources that I posted. I'm posting very specific sources for a reason. I'm posting LGBTQ organizations in Africa. Rightify Ghana is one of the most popular ones. They became really popular over the past 5 years as all of these anti-LGBTQ conversations have started to spark up. And a couple of trans folks like Angel Maxine, who is I believe she's an artist or an actress in Ghana, and she has spoken up, and she has also have been one of the people who have had to travel out of Ghana just to be safe. And so make sure you guys check out and follow and do your own research on these different sources that I'm also posting, because again, those of you who are looking to travel and move to Africa, being up to date through African sources is very important. And a lot of us travel to these countries and we don't know where to get our information. We don't know who to trust. We don't know what's going on the ground outside of the travel.gov website. So I'm posting these sources very intentionally because I want you guys to actually be able to do your own research and interact and engage with African news resources, because it is very limited and they need all of our support. So I hope this video helped you guys to kind of understand what's really going on. So let's keep this conversation going. Until next time.